I'm going to ask each of my guests to introduce themselves and talk just a little bit about the Barr Foundation and Mass Smart Growth Alliance and the Great Communities Collaborative in general, and then we'll take a minute and quickly go around so you guys can introduce yourself and your organizations, and then I'll start the discussion up here and you guys will just jump right in. So Mary, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi there. My name is Mary Skelton Roberts. I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Barr Foundation, and that's a family foundation here in Boston.
Oh, we're supposed to turn our mics off. Oh, it's not that big a room.
And we do grant making in 3 different areas at the foundation. We do arts and culture, education, and climate change. And I manage the climate change portfolio with my colleague Mariella Porter, who's in this morning's session. Our goal in climate change is to really reduce greenhouse gases in the 2 largest areas in Boston and Massachusetts, which is buildings and transportation. A lot of the work I've been focusing on is how do you think about getting people out of their cars. So if we want to ever reduce greenhouse gases and make sure that in the process of doing that, a lot of the gains we've achieved have been in the buildings. We have lots of old buildings in Boston. We've done a lot of work around retrofitting and energy efficiency. If we don't begin to tackle the transportation problem, all of the gains we've done in buildings will be negated by transportation. So my goal is to figure out how do we get people out of the cars, and we do that by thinking about having really good funded transportation, by giving people alternatives that are better than them getting in their vehicles, and by helping them think about communities that are more connected and compact and accessible to the things they want to get to. So
great. André?
Should I speak into this?
Yes, you should.
Okay.
You should put the little switch on so the red light is.
I'm André Leroux from the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance. We're a coalition of organizations ranging from environmental to community development, housing, and planning groups. And we do 3 things. We change state policy in support of more livable, walkable, sustainable communities. We build regional constituencies that cut across issues and sectors around these things to build that kind of regional constituency for the systems change. And then we support local coalitions and projects that push the envelope and create some best practices.
Great. Can you talk for 1 minute about Great Communities?
Yes, and so part of how we support the local groups is our Great Neighborhoods program, which is similar to the Great Communities Collaborative.
Which I'm going to visit next month.
Yes, in the San Francisco area, and they were part of our inspiration to create the Great Neighborhoods program. But the idea behind it is that we weren't seeing enough. We did most of our work for many years at the state policy level, at the 15,000 foot level, but we still weren't seeing a lot of the kinds of projects being built on the ground that we wanted to see, that we expected to see in Massachusetts. And part of the issue is that there's a lot happening in terms of innovation at the local level with practitioners. There's a lot happening with organizations and advocates at the state policy level. It's in Massachusetts, since we're a home rule state with 351 cities and towns, it's hard sometimes to bridge between those 2 arenas. And so we created the Great Neighborhoods program to help bring practitioners and policy advocates together so that we could be informed at the state level about the real institutional and systemic barriers that local folks were butting up against when they were trying to get projects in the ground. And we figured that if we worked with those folks directly and we could accelerate their work and help them overcome some of those barriers, that they could be more effective, and we'd also build that constituency that we need at the state level for change.
Great. So the focus of this panel is about transportation, but about transportation as a lever for social change. And I think all of us up front who work on this issue work on it not just to change transportation per se, but to change communities and people's lives. One of the projects that the Dukakis Center did recently with a partner group called Neighbor to Neighbor, which is a Latino organizing group that had funding from the Barr Foundation, was to actually go out and talk to low-income Latino families in Worcester and Lynn and Springfield and East Boston, and I have some copies of that report if folks are interested. And what we found is that transportation is really central to the lives of people in communities, and the ability to change transportation to make it easier to get to work, to job training programs, to community colleges, to healthy food, to programs for their kids, can be what Orson Watson referred to during the lunch plenary as a game changer, right? We need to find game changers that aren't just hurricanes and elections. I mean, those are two good examples, but I think waiting for a hurricane is probably not a great strategy for most communities, and winning elections is great, but doesn't always work. So I think one of the questions that I want to ask Mary and André to start with is this whole issue of why is it accurate to think of transportation work as being a lever for social change? Is there something about transportation that can make it a game changer, not just in community conversations around moving from point A to point B, but in the bigger community conversations that really occupy people's communities, which is their economic health, their fairness, and the quality of life in those communities? So, I don't know, André, you want to take this one first?
Sure. So I'll answer that by talking a little bit about why we might not start with transportation, which is that there's transportation and land use are really two sides of the same coin when we're talking about creating places where that are vibrant, welcoming, diverse, prosperous, and where you can get around and access your opportunities. And frankly, for most places that have been built over the last 60 years in an auto-centric pattern, we're not talking about a change that you can make from one day to the next. This is going to be a long-term generational change in the community. So, there's oftentimes no silver bullet around transportation. And it's very difficult for people to get their minds around how do you recreate and rebuild your community. And so what I would say, and what we do in our Great Neighborhoods initiative, is that transportation is really about connecting walkable places. And that the first thing that you need to do is find which of those places in your community are walkable or could be made walkable, and where you could create these nodes of activity that people want to be. We need more places in our state that are attractive to people and investment. And frankly, transportation often doesn't work until you're already connecting walkable places. And so we don't necessarily talk about infrastructure or transportation, but we talk about what makes a great neighborhood. And it's really all of those kinds of things. You want a mix of uses, you want a mix of people, and you want good access to jobs and housing and recreation and shopping. And once you can build that foundation, oftentimes there's some sort of planning, rezoning that needs to happen. Then people understand that level. They understand their neighborhoods and how that all fits together. And then you can talk about sort of what kinds of infrastructure will support and enhance that.
Great. And Mary, like André was saying, you do policy work, but you also support the place-based work. What are you trying to accomplish in place-based work?
So at the place-based work, what we're trying to accomplish is we want to create examples of communities that are walkable and bikeable, accessible, that people have a lot of the amenities and their needs are close to where they live. Because what we do know about transportation is that most of the transportation-related greenhouse gases are spent on non-work commute. So it's the soccer mom taking the kid to work, it's the person that has to do lots of different errands. And so to the extent that we can minimize the amount of commute time that people take, we can actually reduce greenhouse gases. So it's interesting because at the foundation, my business is transportation, but we often have to ask ourselves, transportation for what purpose? It's because people need to get somewhere. So if we can have a better sense of where do people need to get to, and how do we shorten their commutes? How do we make it easier for them to get there, where they need to go? It helps us achieve our goal of greenhouse gases. So in our work, we fund great neighborhoods because we know, as André is saying, is having those neighborhoods that are where people need to be is one way in which we reduce greenhouse gases. We look at housing. We're not housing funders, but we've also know is that if you want people that ride public transit, they have to be the housing has to be near public transit. We also know if you displace people that actually ride public transit, you don't get your greenhouse gases. So in some sense, a lot of this work for us is interconnected, and even though there are areas that we may not support, we may try to partner or find other opportunities to address those issues. But for us, those things are all interrelated. Where people work, where they go to school, where they have recreational activities, all of those things, sort of people's well-being is connected to where they need to be and where they need to go. So to us, those things are kind of connected.
Great. So I do want to take a minute and just, since it's a small group, if folks just want to say their name, organization, maybe what community they're from, And if you have something like you want to try to get us to cover very briefly, brief comments are welcome. So why don't we start up here?
Oh, I'm Holden. I'm actually just here for the AV, but I'm a Northeastern student and I'm studying sociology and environmental studies, so I'm actually very interested in this.
Great.
It works out well.
I'm Laura Haas. I'm the grant writer with the City of Somerville.
Great.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Savicki, and I work here at Northeastern in the Office of Corporate and Foundation Relations.
Great.
I'm Kaylee Whitehouse. I'm an MBA and PP student at Brandeis. I'm Hiroshi Soigo. I'm a program associate at the Boston Foundation.
Great. Let's start up here.
Hi, I'm Annie Schreiber. I'm the Development Operations Manager at the Boston Children's Course, and I actually am originally from Chicago. And the Orange Line was started in Chicago, and that took the South Side. When I started high school, it took the South Side to downtown in 30 minutes. So I'm totally on board with what you're laying down.
Great.
My name is Jonathan Cave. I'm not affiliated with any organization, but I'm wanting to pursue urban planning, so I thought I would come to the meeting.
Ben.
I'm Ben Foreman from Massey.
Rob Manzi from Europe.
I'm Kelly Chambers, and I'm a student here at the university, and I study human services.
I'm sorry, tell me what you study.
Human services?
I'm Lauren Curry, and I work in the Office of Community Service at Lesley University.
I'm Sierra Mondi, and I work in the Service Department at Wellesley College.
I'm Carly Camisa. I'm a student at Northeastern studying Human Services and International Affairs.
Great. So let's do another round from up here, and then we'll see if folks have specific questions. So one of the goals of this workshop is to think creatively about transportation, to think about it in a way that's maybe a little out of the box and would help generate some kind of change, transformative change in a community. So André and then Mary, if you can talk about some examples of how you either have seen that happen or how you're hoping it might happen.
Okay. Well, some of our great neighborhoods communities include the City of Lawrence, City of Somerville, the town of Winchester, some neighborhoods in Boston along the Fairmount corridor and in Roxbury, and also in New Bedford. And so they're very different environments in which transportation plays a role, but they all play a pretty strong role. So you look at the town of Winchester, for example, there's a commuter rail station. It's only 10 minutes from North Station in Boston, and yet they haven't built anything new around that train station in a generation, right? And they could double the amount of housing that's down there, creating new opportunities for young people who want to start households, very good school system, and have good access to downtown, as well as a beautiful little businesses. So working in something like that, it's really about building the political will for groups of people to work together to overcome the inertia, right? It's much easier to stop things from happening than to make something happen. And whether you're talking about a community like Winchester or a community like Lawrence, that's really been the case for a long period of time. So, our philosophy is you might have in town a few affordable housing advocates, a few bike advocates, a few arts people, but they all tend to be isolated, right? They're working in their own silos. Now, that means when comes time to do something and projects of different kind get proposed, the forces of no swamp that small kind of force of yes that's behind the project. So if we can connect those people around different issues, if we can get the climate change committee together with the parks people and all those other folks that I mentioned, you're starting to create sort of not a no in my backyard coalition, but a yes in my backyard coalition. And that's really the core of building a civic platform that's at the heart of great neighborhoods. And so, that's really where I feel that most communities need to start with that before they can launch into doing specific kinds of projects. But a lot of what we do is really infill development. Reducing parking requirements is something that's very critical as well, because if you're building, most communities, their zoning requirements around parking are out of whack with a walkable community. And so if you have 25% of your area that you want to be walkable is actually just asphalt and surface parking, that's really not going to get you where you want to be.
Great. Mary?
So a lot of the creativity that I've seen emerging is when we start looking at what are the outliers, and I'll give you a couple of examples. We the Barr Foundation has done some work with John Powell where he talks about situationness, really looking at where people are situated, so that if you're going to come up with a solution or a strategy, you got to figure out where are people already situated in their social condition. And so as Barr started to think about at the policy level, we really wanted to fund better transportation for as many people as we could. We also asked ourselves, are there some people that need to get where they need to go and don't have access to public transportation? And that led us to the study that Stephanie did with Neighbor to Neighbor that said, well, what about lower income Latino communities that are outside of the transportation system, and we know that they don't have public transit? How are they getting around? And that research for me was sort of what Orson was talking about this morning, a game changer, because it had us look at how are people getting around informally. We know they don't have public transit, so they've got to be using some kind of vehicle. How do we understand what that is, and then how do we learn from that, and then what is the next step? Because it's not just important to learn from it. Is there something that we can do to help support those networks? So I want to turn it back over to you and have you say a little bit about that project.
So, both André and Mary touched on things that I think other speakers today have also touched on in terms of where philanthropy can be working with communities to make a difference. So one of those areas is clearly around convening, right? So because as André said, that the constituency for quote unquote transportation is usually pretty small, and also tends to be not even for transportation so much as for biking or for walking, or for even within transportation, people are very siloed. So that convening function, that pulling folks together with philanthropy, with maybe a community nonprofit, and getting the people who see pieces of the agenda as relevant to the thing they care about is really important, because otherwise you don't, as André said, have that big enough constituency. Mary's talking about another piece, which is research. And research is really important for a couple of reasons. So one is research can be designed to be empowering. So in the field of public health, one of the things that I would argue actually qualifies for what Orson called a game changer has been this idea of community-driven public health research, where the research itself, the research questions and the work of gathering the data are actually done in the community. And we don't do that as much in the land use, transportation, economic development field. And so we structured the Neighbor to Neighbor project that way. So we were actually training the canvassers from the community residents, and paying them, by the way, so it was employment, to go talk to their neighbors, which means, quite frankly, that they got way better data. That, we have wonderful students at Northeastern, but honestly, if I had sent a bunch of Northeastern students into a certain neighborhood in Worcester or Springfield to knock on people's doors and ask questions, I'm not sure if the doors would have been answered, I'm not sure if people would have agreed to the survey, and I don't know how long they would have been willing to chat. But if it's your neighbor, and you've seen them before, and they've been around to talk about voter turnout, or the senior center issue, or the bus stop being canceled, they're going to talk. So that's the first thing, is thinking about, as one potentially transformative way to get a conversation going in your community, come up with a research project that's not just research for the sake of data gathering, but research for the sake of actually getting people together to think about the things. The second reason that I think that research is important is answering the question that we're pretty sure we don't know the answer to, right? So one of the answers in this research was that there is a fairly large population of low-income people who are car dependent but don't even own cars. They're so car dependent, they're actually dependent on somebody else's car to get around. That was about 1 in 6 of the more than 300 people we talked to in 4 communities. That's a really big chunk. And the way most conventional transportation planning does research is first they ask you if you have a car. And then if you don't have a car, they then start asking you questions about walking and biking and transit. But they never actually then say, well, if you don't have your car, do you rely on someone else's car? And our partners in the community had told us as we were designing the survey questions that this was a really common behavior. And so when we asked first, do you have a car or not have a car? But then the no car, we still asked them all the questions about car use, even though they said they didn't own one. And so we were able to find out that part of the answer to this question of how people get around is they use other people's car. Part of the answer is they walk. Including, by the way, if they miss the bus, they actually walk the bus route, because the buses are so infrequent in some of these communities that at that point it's faster to just walk than it is to wait for the next bus, which was pretty depressing. So we learned some answers that were very helpful to then thinking about what you would change to make their communities better places and people's lives better. But to me, one of the most interesting things was that research helped us find out that the things we thought we knew were actually wrong. So we picked East Boston to be like the control community because Springfield and Worcester and Lynn were the places that didn't have MBTA rapid transit service. So the thought was, well, East Boston, they got the blue line right there, and they'll be our examples of low-income Latino families who have great transit. We'll compare their lives to these low-income Latino families in these other places. And it turns out that the blue line is great if you're using it to get to work. But when one of the other things that our partner said is, well, you know, people don't use one kind of transportation. They use different kinds of transportation for different kinds of trips. So don't just say, how do you get to work, or what is your primary means of transportation? So we broke it out into how do you get to work, how do you go shopping, how do you get to medical appointments, to see if there were different answers. And in East Boston, where 80% of our respondents told us that they got to work on transit, 1 in 4 told us they use taxis to go grocery shopping, which is, I mean, the average family in this survey earned under $20,000 a year. So if you think about a cab fare, probably 2 cab fares actually, that's huge. And so this issue of healthy food and access to healthy food, which another group is off talking about now, but which a lot of us care about even if it's not the center of what we work on, right, turns out in part to be a transportation issue, right? If you see low-income families taking taxi cabs, that tells you that there's probably not a good healthy food source very close to their community. And by the way, it tells you that using transit to go grocery shopping doesn't work. And if you think about it, most of us would not choose to do weekly grocery shopping for a larger family or household by transit if we had any other choice, right? So on the one hand, it seems obvious in retrospect, but the truth is the assumption was that East Boston was the place where we didn't need to worry about transportation, and it was our control, but it actually was a place. It just had a very specific kind of transportation issue. So I think that there's a convening role for both funders and community groups, but there's also this idea of research, not just to be data wonks or make points, but research as a genuine joint enterprise between philanthropy and the community and maybe academia in some cases, as a way of getting the conversation going and understanding the realities of people's lives, which at the end of the day, I think one of Andre's most important points is the way you actually use transportation to leverage community change may be that you don't talk about it as transportation. And that's a really important insight. So does anyone in the audience want to jump in with a question or a comment at this point? Because we'd be happy to pull folks in. All right, if not, I will just keep pestering the panelists. Given what we've been talking about, if someone came to you and said, I want to start a conversation in my community that will use transportation as a lever to get at these other issues, economic development, climate change, food access, jobs, what are the most important pieces of advice you would give them given your experiences?
Great question. I would probably say engage your local officials in beginning to do some urban mobility planning, which is what the City of Boston is going to do. If you're able to get city officials, neighborhood residents from different neighborhoods of Boston or any place, Cambridge, wherever it is you live, local planning officials, community-based groups at the table trying to figure out, what do I want my future, my community to look like? What do I want the future of mobility? Notice we're not saying transportation, but how we need to get around based on changing demographics, where we need to go, what are the needs that are, what are our needs? I think it sets the tone for a really good conversation that's not just about transportation, but how do you think about the built environment? How do you think about amenities, making things that are close by for people to get to? I mean, I think it's engaging lots of different people in a really good long-term planning process.
André?
I'll follow up on that, and I'll give a specific example. So when we started our Great Neighborhoods work in New Bedford, we were invited in because there was a perceived lack of civic capacity in a particular neighborhood, the Acushnet Avenue corridor, which is a largely immigrant, old commercial area. So a lot of businesses, but not ones that are big, successful businesses, and a lack of no community development corporations or other types of groups there. So we started a process, and we did not call them planning meetings at all. We basically had a series of community dinners where we invited people, small business people. We asked some of the local restaurants to donate some food. So we had a range of food from very, wonderful food from different ethnic backgrounds, and we basically asked everybody to talk about their neighborhood and their experience in that neighborhood. And we were able to engage through, at least one of the organizations had a lot of contacts in the local Mayan immigrant community, right? So you were talking about a population whose first language wasn't English, wasn't Spanish, it was Quiche Mayan, and they were basically for the first time engaging in a civic dialogue because they had been a voiceless population. In fact, they'd been preyed upon by waves of criminals in the city, and this turned out to be one of the big issues that they were dealing with, right? So you go in maybe thinking you're going to talk about transportation or placemaking and things like that, and it's really things like public safety and jobs and access. You have to kind of meet people where they're at. So during the course of these, and oftentimes some of these issues are entrees to some of the other systemic improvements as well. So one of the benefits of this quarter is that there actually was a new supermarket was built on a contaminated site. It was like a brownfield site. There was like it was cleaned up. There was a supermarket nearby, so that was great. You had that co-location of getting uses closer together, which is important. You have a bus service, but it only is during the day. So, if they need to go to a health clinic, for example, one of the transportation needs that came up was, they have to take a $20 cab ride downtown if they need any service because buses don't run frequently enough or they don't run long enough. So one of the things now that we're trying to work with the community on is, could we bring mobile health clinics into the neighborhood that will serve that population? So it's a different way of looking at transportation. Rather than getting people to downtown, can we bring the service into the neighborhood? So you have to look, I think, at a combination of those kinds of things.
Can I add something about this project, which is really interesting because Barr was the initial funder of Great Neighborhoods. It is 5 communities, 6 including New Bedford, and each community is completely different. I mean, if you look at Winchester, rumor has it that they modeled Disneyland after it, just to give you a sense of its high. Say that again? The Main Street, yeah, Main Street USA. So high income, high educational achievement rates. And that neighborhood is about how do you think about the Main Street, making it more active so that local businesses can thrive. If you look at Somerville, it's going through large changes because of the Green Line extension. So again, thinking about how do you look at making sure that you're limiting displacement and that it's the community that people that live there can continue to live there. And so they're very different communities, and I think what makes Great Neighborhoods unique is that each community gets to define what makes them great. And so in philanthropy, for us, there was an understanding is that there was no one definition of great neighborhoods. It was kind of, people will decide what makes their neighborhoods great, and then how as philanthropy can we help support those things happening at the local level. So.
Yeah, and just to reinforce that point, I wanted to kind of follow up on a couple points. So this idea of meeting people where they are is one of the things that people, I think, who do community work get, and people who maybe come more from a transportation or land use planning background need to work on. In the 80s, when smart growth, nobody even knew what smart growth meant, the Environmental Protection Agency held a series of meetings in the very, very early stages, and I went to one in the Elmwood neighborhood of Providence, which was a very low income, very racially and ethnically mixed neighborhood, and the moderator put this question on the table, which is, well, what Rhode Island needs for smart growth is that more people should live in Providence and fewer people should live out in the suburbs. So what would it take to get more people to live in Providence? And they started to go around the circle, and the first person said the schools in Providence need to be better. And the EPA moderator said, but that's schools and education, that's not a smart growth issue. And it completely shut the conversation down because that's where the neighborhood was at. And the truth is, that was actually an accurate insight. And fast forward 30 years, people actually get that urban education is one of those things you have to solve if you want to change where people choose to settle. But, and a funny thing, in one of the focus group meetings that we had in Worcester, actually, on the transportation thing, there was a Haitian Creole speaking older woman who worked as a housekeeper in a hotel who was talking about the fact that you know, she didn't use public transportation unless she and she was one of these non-car owning, non-driver's license people, but she didn't use public transportation unless she had to because she would be late for her job, and if you showed up late, basically they fired you, and there was another person in line for your minimum wage job, you know, cleaning toilets in a hotel. And at one point she said, what I think the people who run the buses in Worcester need to do is make a map of where all the people who don't have cars live and run the buses there, which is actually a great description of how to do a bus service planning process. And here's this uneducated, you know, hotel housekeeper who in many ways had a bigger insight into it, but it's because we didn't start by talking, you know, whatever, giving her a half-hour lecture on how you do bus service planning or transportation. We just asked her how was the transportation system affecting her life, and then as she talked about her own life, she actually generalized it to some ideas that you could then incorporate in policy. So I think this idea of meeting people where they are is extraordinarily important. I want to come back to another phrase that André used, though, which is this idea of civic infrastructure, because I think one of the challenges of working particularly in lower income communities or communities that really have been struggling with disinvestment for many, many years, which becomes discouraging after a while, one of the things that they may have much less of is civic infrastructure, both on the nonprofit side and on the municipal side. And one of the things I heard Orson saying is that philanthropy may need to rethink its relationship to the cities themselves and the municipal government, because in many ways some of philanthropic thinking has been to do workarounds, basically, right, for non-functional governments and to kind of go directly to the community. So I'm curious what you guys think about how do you build civic infrastructure and how do you tie the government side of civic infrastructure together with the non-governmental side in order to solve some of these problems.
So Barr partners pretty extensively with the City of Boston, and I think it's the point that Orson said earlier. We do not have deep pockets in the same way that government does. And so what we've spent the last few years focusing on is really helping to support key capacities within the City of Boston to move forward their Boston Climate Action Plan, for example. And that includes having put a fellow in different places. We have a fellow that is doing the eco districts. We have another fellow that is working at the Boston Transportation Department, but making sure that that capacity exists within the city. And the other thing that we help support a lot is helping to support the city do public engagement. So then when they're doing an urban mobility plan or the climate adaptation plan or whatever it is the city is engaging in, helping them be more effective in reaching people in the community. And not just the same people that come to 5 meetings, but really funding whether it's community groups, advocates, a network that can go out and talk to different people, different times, different places in communities throughout the city. So for us, we see ourselves as a partner and sort of as an extension of what's happening with the city, and not as a sort of a separate entity running, sort of doing our own thing on the side, because we recognize that our success is directly linked to how much capacity exists at the local and municipal government.
Great.
Yeah. And my experience has been that a lot of local governments share the same values as a lot of the community partners, but for some reason it's hard for them to get on the same page or admit that, and sometimes they're in parallel tracks. So, you know, a couple of examples. In Somerville, we worked with we work with a coalition of groups that in the past have butted heads with the city at certain points, even though probably 85% of the goals are really shared. And I think one of the ways in which we were a productive sort of partner with those local community groups was helping them understand that they would be more relevant if they engaged with the city more effectively. Because if you you can have some great community engagement and planning meetings, but if that doesn't get translated into the realm of the city's plan, then you're really missing out on the systemic impact that you can have there. So I think that, now I think there's been a very productive collaboration between a lot of the civic groups in Somerville and the municipal government, and they co-led the Community Preservation Act campaign recently, which is bringing millions of dollars a year for historic preservation, affordable housing, and parks into the municipal budget. And same thing with the town. So we thought when we worked with the town of Winchester, going back to that example, we thought, well, that was the one great neighborhoods community where we were working. Our sort of a partner was the government. And so we said, well, that'll be the easiest one, right? It's a wealthy community. It's the town we're working with. They'll be able to decide and do things. And it has been super challenging because we have learned that government is itself a coalition building process in order to be effective, right? You have different departments, you have agencies, you have to get all of those people on the same page. And so you have to do that whole political process that you do with the community groups in government. And the challenge there is that with local governments, you have people that are there for a long time, and they might think, well, this is just a new idea. I'm going to be around when you're gone, and I don't have to do what you are telling me to do. And so it's a different kind of coalition building. And so from both sides, you have to understand that the local community partners can really add a lot to the local government as well. So in Winchester, they're very afraid of opening the civic dialogue, and we're trying to explain to them, you have allies out in the community, but you have to engage them in the process, and they're scared of doing that. And if you do that, you can build you can generate a coalition and a movement that's going to help you make the local changes to the ordinances that you want to make.
So I think this issue of how you get alignment, right? So because one of the good things about transportation that we've been talking about is it touches so many different people and it touches so many different issues that at some level it's a great organizing principle for a larger social change conversation, because whether your concern is climate change or quality of life or access to jobs or healthy food, there's something in it for you to be in a transportation conversation. But the flip side of that is there's so many different stakeholders in any conversation around transportation, both inside the government, as André just explained, and also outside. And one of the things that Orson again talked about at lunchtime was that one of the roles of philanthropy is this issue of making sure all the stakeholders have a place at the table. But even once you set that table, the job of actually getting the people sitting around it to sort of focus on one or a limited number of achievable directions is a really challenging one. So we're saying that we want, the title of the session is Transportation as a Lever for Social Change. How do you do that lever? How do you, if you succeed in actually getting a large number of voices to the table, how do you actually then get folks pulling in the same direction around one or more specific sets of ideas?
Well, the way that we've done it with Great Neighborhoods is by starting the conversation, letting people talk about what do you want your community to be like in 10 years, 15 years, right? So getting people out of the frame of mind of, well, we can't do that because of this, or we tried to do that and we can't. Just saying, well, where do you want to be, down the road? And once you're able to create that vision, which is much more of a story about what kind of a community you are and your identity, where you want to go, then we find that, okay, well, let's put some goals on that, right? So if we want to have a vibrant, walkable place, then we need to increase foot traffic by 25% right on the street, or we need to have double the amount of housing in Winchester Town Center, or we need to create bike lanes, in a bike path system, and whatever that is. So then we're able to say, okay, we all have agreement among all these different groups, among a few, maybe 5 goals that are measurable and that we can hold ourselves accountable to. And then, okay, well, what do we need to do in the next 2 to 3 years to stay on course? And we break it down that way. And that's sort of how we come at a work plan, but we come at it from sort of the big to the smaller, and we call a strategic action framework, which can be just like a 2-page document with the goals and the vision and some of the immediate action steps. So sort of like planning and doing at the same time.
What André's describing is really important because in philanthropy, it's hard to fund that. It's hard to figure out what is it. And I often get calls from other foundations that are saying, what is Great Neighborhoods? And in some sense, it's a couple of key things that's happening in that project. One is that in setting the table, Great Neighborhoods functions almost as the interpreter. they're sort of interpreting the language that planners speak, interpreting the language that transportation people speak, interpreting the language that communities speak, and even those are not monolithic. And in some sense, by doing that interpretation, they're able to help people get on the same page. Once they're on the same page, there's a piece of work around what is our aspiration? Sort of what do we want to be? What should we focus on? And that's not easy stuff to put your hands around or to fund, but it's the important work that happens at the ground. And it's how you end up getting those great neighborhoods. That then you have those models that you can say to the state and national policymakers, this actually worked. But it's not clean and it's messy and it's hard to describe. And so in philanthropy, you have to do a really good job of saying, even though we're focused sometimes on getting policy change, unless you have those good examples on the ground, you don't have anything to point to. So this work is really critical for us to support in philanthropy.
Yeah, it's been one of our biggest challenges is to kind of communicate what's our value. Everybody's like, well, this is all great, but what did you do, And so that's setting that aside. I think one of the things that's most effective about breaking down these silos is that you have to have these shared goals, right? And even in places that have long-standing coalitions, local groups that are working on something like the Fairmount Collaborative, I don't know if many of you might be familiar with that in the city of Boston, around the commuter rail line, trying to turn that to more of a mass transit line, or even around, in Somerville around the Green Line extension. Getting groups to advocate for each other's interests is really a game changer, I would say. So when I did work up in Lawrence before I came to the Smart Growth Alliance, and one of the things that we realized when we brought a lot of people together, we did a community visioning process, a lot of enthusiasm, everybody was excited, big kickoff event, congressman, mayor, everybody was like, yay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna revitalize Lawrence. And then we're like, well, we sat down and we looked at the zoning and we're like, okay, well, we can't do any of it because the zoning doesn't let you put jobs like restaurants, printing, biotech, anything housing, anything you might want to put in a mill building nowadays, these beautiful buildings, like you cannot put there. They hadn't changed the zoning in 60 years. It was still from, relic of the old heavy, dirty industry era when you're trying to separate those uses. And so, what we had to do was basically, we came up with a zoning district idea, and we engaged, the artists, the mill owners, the small business community in the downtown, the residents, the Latino, Spanish-speaking residents, and we basically had to get them all together to understand that they all had shared interests, right? And we did that by having separate focus groups because there was a lot of distrust among groups, and we videotaped each of those focus groups so people felt comfortable among their peers saying some things that were like maybe not very PC, but we were able to then take clips of those videos and show them to each other where, for example, an out-of-town white mill owner was basically saying, my family's been invested in this building and this business and this community for a long time. We want Lawrence to succeed. Whereas the local, Spanish community might have been thinking, well, these are families that are just extracting wealth from the city and don't care about the city. And on the other hand, some of the mill owners were thinking, well, you know what? Oh, the city's gone downhill since the Spanish immigrants started coming 30, 40 years ago, and there's trash on the streets, nobody picks up anything. But we're able to show that, the Spanish residents, like the first thing that they talked about and complained about was why the street's so dirty, why does the people who, the city services, when they come to pick up the trash, they throw like half of the bucket in the back of the truck, the other half falls on the ground, and like nobody does anything about it because there's no accountability, right? There's no municipal trash cans on the sidewalks. And so by being able to show that both of these very different groups that had a dialogue with each other, they really shared similar interests, generated a lot of enthusiasm. And we were able to get, then when we went to the planning board and with a zoning change, we were able to get the mill owners standing up and saying, you know what, we need to have an affordable housing requirement for when we change the zoning around these mills. And we had the local residents basically saying, we need to be able to put businesses, viable commercial businesses and housing in these things. And so people were advocating for each other, and at first it blew people's minds because the planning board was like, whoa, wait a second, they'd never seen anything like this before, these groups working together. And they were like, what kind of diabolical, coalition is happening here? Do they want to turn these mill buildings into new tenements? Who's making the money? Somebody's profiting here between the poor people and the mill owners, But we were able to really stop people and get them to think differently about things, and that's, I think, what you need to do locally is get people advocating for each other's interests.
Any questions or thoughts from folks in the audience? Yep.
So I work for the city of Somerville, but I also live there. And sort of what keeping with what you've been saying, we've had the Green Line extension coming through for maybe 2 decades now. We also have the Orange Line going up to Dudley Square. And it's been, to some extent, you know, we've talked in terms of talking about controlling the game changer. It's been somewhat chaotic, I mean, not chaotic exactly, but we are having meetings all the time. And I mean, Somerville is only 4.1 square miles, and it's divided into these little squares. And each square has its meetings, and what do you want your community to look like? And we changed the zoning, we have arts overlay districts, we have people talking about what to do with our few little mills. We have, you know, each individual square has meetings about what they want to do. We have individual meetings about what to do with buildings. We have individual meetings about what to do with the police chief who just left, and what kind of person do we want to have to be the police chief of the city. But, and it can make you crazy. But we also have a really good process, I guess, for controlling meetings and making sure that they're not insane, that people listen to each other, that they're documented, that people can read about them the next day in the newspaper. And it's, I wouldn't say it's, you know, perfect, but it's certainly, it could be utter chaos, and it's not. It's to some extent at this point it feels like the transportation is happening to us. I mean, you know, the federal government is taking it, it's bringing the money in, the state's bringing the money in, it's happening to us. People don't, you know, are already sort of counting the amount of money that their house value is going to go up. We don't know what's going to happen to people who are living in rental apartments. Probably not good things, but it is happening because in a fairly organized way. But it's all happening at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that reinforces Mary's earlier point, which is this is not a linear process. It's an incredibly chaotic process, and a lot of communities wouldn't have the patience to have that much chaos, and some philanthropy wouldn't necessarily have the patience to sort of say, we're going to put our money out there and sort of let things circle around until they sort of organize themselves into something. So I think that that's a real issue. The other thing that I heard that's very real, and one of the challenges that everybody faces, is this whole meeting fatigue problem, right? Because and it's yet another reason for not focusing the conversation on transportation, but for focusing on the meetings on either what kind of community do you want, or what do you need to make your life better, because there's already so many meetings on specific things that sometimes what happens is people actually don't have the space to talk about the thing they care about, whether that's public safety or whatever. And so if you're willing to sort of have a bit of a more open-ended meeting, it's helpful. When the MBTA held the meetings on the last fare increases a couple of years ago, and this is about to happen again, you know, if you actually go and listen to those meetings, which I did, a lot of people are not coming to talk about the fare. It's their one shot at the people who run the T to say, can you fix my bus, or why is this stop, you know, there's a senior center, you know, there's a senior housing right there, and they have to walk 3 blocks to get to the T. Couldn't you move the T, you know, closer to the seniors, you know, so they don't have to do it. So I do think that people get frustrated by sort of having to sort out which place to go to raise the thing that's on their mind. And so part of that means it's incumbent on the nonprofits, the municipalities, the conveners to make a space for that conversation. Other thoughts or comments?
What neighborhood in Boston is doing it well? Or what community? I live in Boston, so I care about Boston, but what?
And when you say it, what do you mean by it?
Yeah, right.
It, what you're discussing.
Transportation?
Great neighborhoods, urban mobility, getting people to these spaces where people populate and congregate. Well, who does that well? Who's succeeding?
Well, you know, I mean, Boston has a lot of advantages over other communities in the Commonwealth because they have more resources, being a bigger city. They have more, you know, control, more professional staff. So I would say that, you know, their challenges are different. They also have a lot of mass transit there too, right? So there is neighborhoods which have had historically underutilized their mass transit stops and now have been trying to develop more around them. And so I think that they've done a good job of trying to engage with community folks more around that. For example, around the Fairmount line that I talked about, this was an idea that didn't come from the city originally, but it came from actually came from a research paper originally, and then was picked up by a collection of community or groups mobilizing around the Fairmount line to try to create more stations. And the Fairmount line is basically a commuter rail line that's unique because it's the shortest commuter rail line in the whole MBTA system. It's entirely within the city of Boston. And it used to basically serve a lot of the low-income communities along that line. They used to have more stations. But when they turned it into a commuter rail line, they got rid of a lot of the stations and they bypassed the low-income neighborhoods. Those low-income neighborhoods, the community coalition came together to advocate for getting those stations, and they have been rebuilt and they're opening. And some of them have already opened. So now there's a whole planning process that's happening with the city of Boston is convening, but with a lot of civic participation for each of the station areas and then along the corridor as a whole. So I would say that's a really, I think, a good, the city of Boston was not initially, I think, a strong leader on that whole Fairmount corridor, but the civic, the coalitions, the community groups organized so much and over such time, it became mainstream, right? It became inevitable almost. And when I was working up in Lawrence, for example, we would always tell the mayor whenever we had something to do, we'd be like, look, we're putting all these people together in a room, we're doing all these kinds of things, but we can't do it without the city. I mean, we don't care about the credit piece. We want you to, we're building a parade, we want you to stand at the head of it, right? And so I think that's really what people can do around these kinds of things, because shifting, just particularly when you talk about transportation, very difficult, like the bureaucracies and the engineering culture that's around transportation is very difficult to change, and you can't do it really unless you have a very clear community vision and a strong coalition behind you, I'd say.
Yeah. In terms of communities that are doing it well, one of the things that philanthropy can do is really help set the tables so that these communities that are in transition and changing, so that the outcomes are less random and more designed and well thought out. And the communities that are sort of on the precipice of success, I think Somerville, because they have a lot of dialogue and a lot of engagement. There's a lot of potential in Dudley Square, because that neighborhood is going through an incredible amount of transformation, and they're looking at issues about, how do we prevent wide-scale displacement? People, if they want to leave, should be able to leave, but people that want to stay should be able to stay. And they're beginning to tackle some of those questions. So I think the communities that are really engaging, thinking about how they plan sort of community transformation and social change, that you're starting to see the benefits accrue to people that have lived in those communities for a long time, those are the ones. Can I pinpoint one that actually has done it right? Not really.
Can I just say, I think Somerville is doing a really good job on that. And, Dudley Square, I would say too, the interesting thing about Dudley is that that's where the Silver Line ends, right? It's been a major regional sort of bus hub for a long time. But what it's lacked is being a great place, right, for a long time. Used to have a very vibrant business community, but it got gutted for a long time, and now it has an opportunity to rebuild itself with Mayor Menino relocating the Boston Public Schools down there. She got 500 jobs now going to Dudley Square. You have a new police station, you have some vacant parcels that are being RFP'd for development. You have the Bartlett Yards project where we work with Nuestra Comunidad and to turn that into a little urban village. It's just a very 2-minute walk from there. So there's a real opportunity, and the question is, are all these pieces going to come together, and who coordinates that? Now the city doesn't necessarily coordinate it all, right? They do their best to kind of plan to RFP the parcels and all, but could still use, I think, more of an ongoing dialogue around that place.
And to their credit, that has begun. They're starting to look at how do you look at Dudley Square from a transportation, housing, arts and culture, community development. It's one of the first times I've actually seen the city begin to have this conversation across city departments.
Right. And I think, I want to, I know we started a little late, but I think the reception's already starting downstairs, and one of the best parts of events like this is networking. So to sort of just wrap up, I think one of the themes for not only this session but the day is at the end of the day, social change and effective philanthropy is about making connections. And I think that one of the reasons that transportation works so well as an issue for organizing around is that transportation is actually the physical way in which we connect to each other and to our surroundings. And because it's all ultimately about connections, and because transportation only works if you have networks and if you get out of silos and if you work across departments and issues, it creates a platform for having conversations that are not limited to departments, to neighborhoods, or to issues. That said, there is no guarantee of success. But if the question is, can you start a conversation in your community about transportation and turn it into a conversation about transformation, I think the answer is clearly yes. So thank you all for coming. We're happy to hang around and talk some more, or we're happy to just continue the conversation downstairs at the reception. Thanks. And thanks to Mary.